I am the program lead for the End of Life Studies Masters, and I'm also a researcher, and I have predominantly most of my academic career been a researcher. And with my background in medical anthropology, my predominant interest is in the culture of medicine and the social relations of care, with particular focus on the end of life. It's not exclusive. So let me just make sure. There we go. One of my research areas is in the topic of total pain. And this is as a concept, a care philosophy, a descriptor of personal experience, and as a diagnosis. And so don't worry if you're not familiar with the term, I'm going to be talking about it in some detail. And I'm interested in total pain as a descriptor of suffering. And it's reasonable to suppose that the whole project of medicine, at least in its early phases, can be conceived of as a response to suffering. But in spite of the centrality of suffering to medicine, modern biomedicine has a tendency to align itself with the natural sciences, which is often concerned with data that's open to inspection from a third-party perspective and generalizable. So contemporary medicine is presented with a dilemma: retain the alignment with science and thus renounce an interest in suffering in a multidimensional way, or acknowledge the reality of suffering, thereby jeopardizing its scientific status in medicine. And I see the concept of total pain as an attempt to synthesize these two different perspectives. And over time, as I work with the idea of total pain, I've become interested in thinking about its origins, its expression, and resolution from a transdisciplinary perspective that draws equally from the social, life sciences, and the medical sciences. Okay, so who here is familiar with the concept of total pain? Joe, my co-author, is familiar. What total pain is an idea. Well, let me start this way. We know that people with advancing life-limiting illness report really high rates of psychosocial, existential concerns with bodily pain and other physical symptoms. In 1964, Cicely Saunders, Dame Cicely Saunders, now often acknowledged as the founder of the modern hospice movement, introduced the concept of total pain to describe a pain that she saw at the end of life as a whole overwhelming experience, which included physical, psychological, social, and spiritual distress, and where the sum is more than each of the parts. And this careful attention to different forms of distress that commonly attended the end of life came in part through her interdisciplinary background. And one of the things that makes Saunders so interesting as a historical figure and as a historical figure in medicine is that she started out as a nurse, then became a social worker or a medical almoner, as was known at the time, and then became a doctor, a medical doctor. And so here I've included from the Cicely Saunders archive an early diagram of her thinking about total pain. And it remains one of my favorite images because there's a lot going on in that image. One of her more well-known sayings was, "Facts are feeling in this house," and by in this house she meant hospice, contemporary hospice, St. Christopher's Hospice. And she valued her patients' feelings at times as, quote, "the most powerful facts of the whole situation." So using the framing of total pain provided visibility and legitimacy for suffering within a medicine in a way that wasn't previously possible. And it revolutionized contemporary biomedical understandings of suffering by connecting it to a clinical concern for physical pain. So it provided medicine with a term to conceive of pain holistically. And I'm interested in the concept of total pain because it's been absolutely central to the development and legitimization of palliative care and palliative medicine, and it continues to sensitize us to suffering as a complex experience that involves the totality of a person. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time because what you're seeing really is a reflection of my own thinking as it evolves around this topic, and I could spend I could do a whole presentation just on the idea of pain, the idea of suffering, and how it's understood in different models over time. So I don't have that time here, and I just want to highlight that there are different theories of pain and suffering, but Saunders, as well as more recent theories of pain and suffering, challenge that they're synonymous. And so for this talk, I summarize pain as an unpleasant sensory or emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with actual or potential tissue damage. So this is the definition from the International Association for the Study of Pain. And I also want to highlight that in my thinking about it and others, it is in part a somatically focused negative emotion resembling a perceived threat. Now, this is a little bit different than definitions of suffering, where suffering refers to perceived threat to the integrity of the self and helplessness in the face of that threat and an exhaustion of psychosocial and personal resources for coping. And so suffering as end-of-life nears is an affective response of bodily experience interpreted and expressed as a negative mental emotional experience. Now that's a lot of words. But what I want to highlight here is that the common ground, the concepts of pain and suffering do share a common ground around this idea of negative affect experienced through the body. And this lends itself well to the anthropological idea of embodiment. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about embodiment and affect because it really will help link together my discussion about the microbiome. So, embodiment. Now, this is the problem with doing presentations, is that you're always doing some form of violence to ideas because you're trying to get them down. And talking about embodiment in one slide is challenging. And so I don't in any way mean for this to be the only way to understand it. But embodiment posits that the human body is not an object to be studied in relation to culture, but rather that experiences of the body are the ways in which culture is made. What we are able to know, feel, and do, in short, who we're able to be, is through bodily experience. Further, the body and what it perceives cannot be disentangled from its lived social and material environments. And so in relation to health and illness, embodiment therefore encapsulates how bodily experiences such as well-being or disruptions to well-being emerge as a result of existing within specific environments and relationships. And so within medical anthropology, the concept has been extended even further to explore how health and well-being are shaped through the literal physical incorporation of these environments into our bodies. And I think, Paul, your presentation clearly highlights how these anthropological ideas have valence across disciplines, because that is exactly what you were talking about. And I found that the car analogy quite a powerful one. So like the multimodal origins of Saunders' total pain, which provides medicine with the term to conceive of pain holistically, theories of embodiment draw our attention to how we interpret experience through our bodies, and it conjoins the physical, social, and emotional considerations. So then on to affect, which is a closely related term. And affect is the collective term for describing feeling states like emotions or moods. It's an experiential state of feeling that can be conscious or unconscious. And so here then, when I'm thinking about embodiment and affect and well-being or pain, our orientations to it in relation to our affective experience is that emotions are the narration of embodied experience. They're the way that we understand and express experiences of being in a body, in our bodies. So feelings are not separate from the body, feelings are the body. All right, having had that little anthropological side note, there are different definitions of total pain that vary in slight detail about those 4 different quadrants. But for me, as an interdisciplinary social scientist, I'm interested in thinking about the concept that is in a larger context using other ideas to see how well they fit together or if anything can be illuminated. And so in talking to you about affect and embodiment, this kind of working definition that I have that's growing of total pain and advanced life-limiting illness is simultaneously negative affect and diminished capacity to strive within the world as we know it. And so with that, now I want to talk about this in relation to advancing life-limiting illness. I'm using the term suffering in this instance, and I'll show you why, to highlight that there's slippage between concepts and within and across disciplines, as well as highlighting that the need to address total pain or the components of total pain continues to be key. It's somewhat hidden narrative about the importance of hospice and palliative care on the global stage. So we see here the Lancet Commission in 2018 released a report on palliative care and pain relief, and this has become one of the foundational documents in advocacy around palliative care globally. And they use the word suffering 122 times in a 64-page report. And they describe it primarily, or they'll define it as serious health-related suffering. And ironically, while they don't use the term, they define serious health-related suffering in the same language total pain is used. So it's these components of physical, social, spiritual, and or emotional functioning. And they go on to highlight the most common and severe symptoms or types of serious health-related suffering, which I won't list there, but you'll see that they are numerous and many. And I also think that it's kind of interesting that it's not lost on me in that developing a definition of suffering based on Saunders' total pain, they continue still to recapitulate the duality between physical and psychological. And I'm going to return to this dichotomy in my conclusion. So I just want to highlight here, though, that the idea of total pain is not something abstract. It's not necessarily something idealized. It is a live orienting device that is currently being used in medicine to justify the practice and direction of medicine across national boundaries. So to me, it is not something that's just a personal or abstract interest, but something that is shaping how we orient ourselves today to ideas of suffering, particularly at the end of life. And so this concept has been central to the development of palliative care, and palliative medicine, hospice care. Yet there's really little in-depth research about this concept or about the experience that we interpret as total pain, and it remains poorly understood. So one of the ways I thought it might be interesting to think about it is through the brain-gut microbiome access, particularly in relation to life-limiting illness and my ongoing interest in total pain. So I open this talk by stating that I've become interested in thinking about total pain from a perspective that draws equally from life, biological, and medical sciences. And One of the reasons I do this is because I believe this transdisciplinarity honors understanding of total pain as a multifaceted experience that necessarily includes attending to the social, material, and biological environments and their interrelationships. I'm also, as I said at the beginning, rather new to this approach, and I'm still growing my knowledge about the relationship between these areas. And so please be generous where this learning in progress is still obvious in my slides. But we do know that in the last 10 years, new forms of biomedical attention have been given to the role of the microbiota in the gastrointestinal tract. And I do say new forms of biomedical attention because, as Manon so clearly showed in her presentation, this concern has been ongoing for hundreds, if not potentially thousands of years. But there's new forms of attending to it with new technologies because, in part, this has been due to technological improvements with the arrival of next generation sequencing and the birth of metagenomics, since most of the bacteria which reside in the gut are anaerobic and unable to be grown via traditional cultural methods. And as a interdisciplinarian, I'm also interested in why certain objects of interest emerge at certain historical times. And it is interesting to think about the history of technology in relation to this new interest. Right? So we're still at the very beginning of learning about the microbiome, even though we know quite a bit, what feels like quite a bit compared to previous eras. What we do know is that the overall health of our microbiome is stress responsive, meaning that it can be negatively or positively affected by a range of physical, social, emotional, and environmental stressors through our life course. Again, this highlights talks that have been going on this morning. And while our understanding of dysbiosis is still growing, studies do evidence that it increases our susceptibility to a wide range of poor health and well-being outcomes. And so these are some of those relationships. And these studies have linked dysbiosis to inflammatory issues and autoimmune diseases, metabolic issues, gastrointestinal diseases, also in relation to stress-related disorders and neurodevelopment and neurodegenerative disorders. There's also quite a bit of significant evidence emerging for the relationship between dysbiosis and inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, diabetes, and even certain types of cancer, such as colorectal cancer, and again, strong emerging evidence linking neurodegenerative diseases such as MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and then things that are often called affective disorders. So things to do with anxiety and depression, behavior, sleep, cognitive functions. And importantly to me as well is that recent literature implicates dysbiosis as a key player in the central sensitization, leading to changes in pain, in pain perception and chronic pain. So we don't know if these links are cause or consequence, but what we do know is that many of these conditions commonly co-present. So I don't have time to talk about all the advancing life-limiting illnesses, so I'm going to go to a party favorite, which is cancer. There's been a fair amount of research done on this, and while there is mounting and sometimes conflicting evidence about the role of the microbiome in the etiology of cancer, I'm not going to go into that discussion today, and I'm just going to focus on symptoms commonly associated with cancer and its progression. And so we know that there are common physical effects such as pain, fatigue, loss of appetite, nausea, wasting, breathlessness, etc. And we also know that this commonly includes what are often categorized as psychoneurological symptoms in the literature. So that's things like anxiety, stress, depression, altered sleep, cognitive dysfunction, and increased sensitivity to pain. And so each of these have been mapped in studies to perturbation of the gut microbiome. And we also understand that unfortunately treatments of cancer can have a substantive and negative impact on the microbiome. And so in conjunction with the challenges I just highlighted, people often experience significant side effects from curative or life-extending treatments that are implicated with the microbiome. And so one of the most common is antibiotics. And given that infections are common in cancer, there's substantial use of them. And clinical studies have confirmed that some antibiotic interventions can increase the risk of depression and anxiety. At the same time, they successfully treat the infection. However, this picture is not just black and white, because with with antidepressants and antipsychotics, some of the drugs now used in psychiatry and neurology were usually originally used as antibacterial agents, and are now used to address what is perceived as psychological distress and even physical symptoms in cancer. But there are very few studies concerning the gut microbiome and second-generation antipsychotics, some which do appear to have dysbiotic effects. Interestingly, at the same time, however, some antidepressants also appear to effectively treat visceral pain. So there's complex pathways and relations that are not necessarily unidirectional. Where there does seem to be some unidirectional concern is around opioid use. Opioids are frontline treatment provided for cancer pain, but they are linked to disrupted intestinal GI barrier and increased inflammation. What happens is that opioids alter the transit time of gut contents. So this causes constipation, so upon initiation, and then diarrhea when you come off of them. And so these both impact quantity and variety of microbes present. And we also know that surgery is very challenging for the microbiome. There's been some really interesting studies in critical and emergency care, mapping patients' microbiomes on admission or before surgery and immediately after. I recommend you don't eat them after lunch. So chemotherapy and radiotherapy. One of the things is that in chemotherapy-induced gastrointestinal toxicity, this occurs in up to 80% of patients who get it. And so this is a real problem because sometimes cancer treatments have to be discontinued because of the side effects. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of chemotherapy-induced cognitive impairment, also known as chemo brain, which is a real challenge in cancer treatment, and the microbiome is an emerging target there to address. So where there isn't a lot of research, and I won't spend too much time on it, but it comes up in part because of the discussion in food today, is enteral nutrition. So PEG feeding, IV tube feeding, often called, is that that has significant repercussions to the diversity of the microbiome in patients. So by this time, you can probably figure out where I'm going with this, but I want to connect the dots between the microbiome and total pain in advancing life-limiting illness. And using the case study of cancer, we see that the range of symptoms in serious illness, as well as treatments, whether that's to address the disease or the symptoms, negatively impact the microbiome, as well as potentially positively in some ways that we're not fully aware of yet. So dysbiosis can create or exacerbate symptoms of serious illness, and microbiome disruptions are common in serious illness situations and can be incredibly harmful in some instances, potentially lethal if you look at some of the critical care studies, leading to what some people call organ failure, that the microbiome itself is an invisible organ, and like other organs, it can fail in critical illness. And so we know, again, as I already said, that people diagnosed with and being treated for life-limiting illness report exceptionally high rates of anxiety, depression, and other forms of psychosocial distress in conjunction with bodily pain and physical symptoms. While this co-occurrence is really well known, these symptom clusters are still commonly divided into separate physiological and psychological or psychosocial disorders. And that's one of the things I showed you about the Lancet paper. And the challenge here is that within end-of-life care, this divide can be further entrenched in care treatments that either privilege a biomedical, such as benzodiazepine or SSRI. So either privilege a biomedical approach or a psychosocial approach. So that social work, talk therapy, spiritual care around the etiology of suffering. But if we're using a brain-gut microbiome access perspective of the relationships involved in physical discomfort and deterioration, emotional distress, behavioral changes, and psychosocial disruption, these may not be so easily separable. So I think it's an interesting tool to think about potentially of thinking of then is one way from, you were using von Opper's bioecological perspective, and from an eco-bio-psychosocial perspective, gut microbes might play a critical part of embodied and effective experiences of suffering, not only in relation to physical symptoms of pain regulation, but also in relating cognitive function and fundamental behavior patterns, such as emotional states, sense of self, capacity to make meaning, and social interaction. And so for me, this is a really interesting question to ask, because this combination can also be conceptualized as total pain in the format I've been talking about. So my question is, as I go into the very last section of my talk, is there anything interesting in considering the concept of total pain as applied to the brain-gut microbiome access? Can it help us to understand suffering in any new ways, including quite literally as a gut feeling? And so that question that I had, I was able to think about how I might want to approach that from a transdisciplinary perspective. And I thought it was a good question to ask. And I was curious to explore these potential connections. And I was able to receive some funding from the Carnegie Foundation. And along with my colleague, Joe, identified and synthesized key concepts and findings relevant to interconnections between embodiment, total pain, life-limiting illness, the brain-gut access, and the microbiome. And so it is a critical interpretive fixed method literature synthesis. Don't ask me what that actually means. But we drew across medical, life, and social sciences. And what I wanted to do here is just show you a little bit about the report. And our backroom nickname for the document is Behemoth, because it is so large. And we've divided it into 6 sections overall, but there are many subsections. And so what we've done is we've looked at as much literature across these disciplines as we were able to find that were relevant to pain, cognition and mood, aging and illness, which Paul very thoroughly covered, but also medical treatments and microbiome interventions that are happening or being promised, being worked on, as well as a section on inter and transdisciplinary perspectives to the microbiome. And I apologize, this is a slide that is going to provide cognitive overload. I don't expect you to read it, but what I just wanted to do was to show you the table of contents so that you get a sense of how extensive the work that we've done actually is. Now, so for example, when we look at cognition and mood, it goes all the way from depression and anxiety to globalization and urban living. We also, under aging, advanced life-limiting and critical illness, have the usual suspects, but we also talk about aging in community, or we don't We review literature about community in aging and community, excuse me. Also hospital environments, the potential impact of COVID with the microbiome. And you'll see here medical treatments impacting the microbiome run the gamut from some things that I was talking about all the way to fecal transplantation and psychedelics. And so the reason I am showing you this in this amount of detail is that really what we were trying to do here is to create a resource, a document that aims to be exploratory rather than exhaustive, and to provide a foundation for further transdisciplinary thought and research. And really, it was to try and create a resource for other social scientists and palliative clinicians interested in this kind of transdisciplinary approaches to health and well-being with a focus on total pain. We're going to release it on the 1st of July as an open access document. And we are doing that on Enlighten. And so just in closing, there's always the kind of so what question. And I could talk quite lengthily about the so what questions, but here I just highlight that studies about the gut microbiome and its role as part of the brain gut microbiome axis, it shows that the integration of the mind and body is similarly mirrored in the holism of total pain. And so I feel like it is a very complementary and extended way of thinking about total pain. And it offers a new way of thinking about pain, suffering, and embodiment in life-limiting illness. I also want to say, including the environments they're situated in, one of the things I'm most interested in the back corner of my mind is around bio-inequalities in the microbiome at the end of life. So dying in poverty, dying in deprivation, and some of the impacts around that. And ideally, I would like to be able to participate in advancing our comprehension of pain mechanisms, as well as being curious as to how social science can support the development of therapeutic strategies so that we are able, if not necessarily to manage, because everything is still in kind of nascent early trials, and we don't yet know what the actual outcome of these will be. But really, it's just about trying to improve and broaden our understanding of suffering, of experiences of suffering at the end of life. And I have some specific recommendations for those who are interested in palliative and end-of-life care, but I'm not going to go into them in great detail here, other than to say that there are practical aspects of this report that will be informing how palliative care practitioners may be able to think about the microbiome in relation to the care they provide to the patients. So, you know, this notion of what's next is, I was able to convince the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network that I had a little bit of money to put this together. And the goal really was to hang out with other cool people. And so for me, I don't have a specific agenda, but I really feel particularly these times call upon us to work across disciplinary boundaries, and that doing so, you know, I've written here that bringing together different approaches can have important ramifications for how we understand and act on the determinants of health, even at the end of life. And I think that's one thing that has kind of been a through thread for all of the talks. And so I've built in some time for us to have that conversation. And so I'm going to end my formal presentation there, other than saying that if you're interested in having a copy of the report, it will be available in the Enlighten repository July 1st. I will also be tweeting about it, and you can just email me directly if you're old school. So thank you.